Hi, in this firing video, I'm going to talk about atmosphere and firing our gas kiln. I will specifically be referring to the Claytarian kiln, although these concepts apply to the car kiln and the soda kiln as well. So in a kiln, it's relatively easy to measure the time and the temperature within the kiln, especially using cones, which measure the work of heat over time. But figuring out what the atmosphere of your kiln is can be a little bit more nuanced. All of our electric kilns and all electric kilns generally fire in a neutral or oxidation atmosphere. It's a really efficient way to fire, and the glazes tend to be quite predictable. There's not a lot of variation in how the clay looks when you fire in an oxidation kiln. And even in our gas kilns, well, generally we use them to fire in reduction. They also have the ability to fire in oxidation. Maybe not our soda kiln, but the car kiln and the Claytarian kiln do. So, but generally, if we're firing glaze work in a gas kiln, we're doing it because we want the effects of reduction in the kiln. So what is, in a gas kiln, what an oxidation or a neutral flame is an even mixture of air and gas. It tends to be a little bit greenish. It's a very efficient flame, so you have the right amount of air for the amount of fuel that you want to burn, so it's burning efficiently. And it's not going to have a huge effect on your glazes. They might look in a gas kiln relatively similar to how they might fire to the same temperature in an oxidation electric kiln. But reducing your kiln in a gas kiln has a lot of different effects on it. It's a gas-rich flame. It's usually yellow in color above about cone 01. But it can also turn blue or green, especially in the later stages of a glaze firing. It's a little bit dirty or inefficient. So when you're firing in reduction, you can run the risk of stalling a kiln, which means it's not climbing in temperature at the rate that you want it. How you tell your kiln is in reduction is it's characterized by a yellow flame coming out of any aperture, typically out of the peepholes in the front. If you look inside the peepholes, you're going to see a hazy or cloudy look with maybe some rolling flames in there. There might also be a slight smell of raw gas or poorly combusted fuel. I feel like if you're smelling raw gas or if you're seeing any sort of black carbon buildup on the peephole, it's reducing too much. So what happens when we put a kiln in reduction, which is basically we starve the fuel of all the oxygen it would like to have to burn efficiently, it starts pulling oxygen out of your clay and then later in the firing out of your glazes. And that means it really oxidizes iron. It really changes the color of copper from green to a beautiful red. It gives you a lot of different effects. Like with a celadon glaze, the glaze could look sort of mostly clear but slightly yellowish in oxidation, not necessarily the most appealing color. And then in reduction, that same celadon glaze will turn the iron, the small amount of iron that's in it, this brilliant jade color, blue or green. So in a reduction glaze firing, the clay is and the glaze are only ready to accept the effects of the reduction atmosphere if at certain times when they are sort of open and ready for that. So for the clay, that's really at around the same temperature that you might have fired the clay first in the bisque firing, so around cone 08 to cone 04, or around like 1870 degrees to 1940 degrees Fahrenheit. So before that, cone 08 or 1870 degrees Fahrenheit, you are going to want to keep the kiln, even though we call it a reduction kiln, you want it to get to that point in the firing very efficiently and completely in an oxidation firing. At that point, all you need to do to keep it in a oxidation flame, climbing and burning efficiently to reach 1780 or cone 08, you just need to keep the damper open on the Claytarian around 4.5 inches. And that should do it. As you get closer to cone 08, you may need to open the forced air in the squirrel cages a little bit, but typically I don't have to. It'll fire just nice and smoothly, climbing really pretty quickly and evenly in an oxidation firing or atmosphere until you get to around cone 08. And then that's the time. The clay is very open to change, it's very porous, but it's going to start getting more dense and vitrified soon. So that's when you want to put your kiln in reduction. To do that, typically you just want to tap the damper in a little bit, sometimes no more than 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch. A very small shift in the damper can have a huge effect on the atmosphere in the kiln. So when you do that, you want to push the damper in a little bit and then wait about 3 or 4 minutes to see how the atmosphere has changed. And then if you want more reduction, then you would at that point adjust again, just a small amount. So for body reduction, you want a pretty big flame. You want it to be at least 1 foot long, nice and orange. Because of our low oxygen in the air in Colorado and because the sun's so bright, sometimes it can be hard to see how big your flame is, and I often like to put like a piece of metal. We have a metal box in the studio that I'll put over the flame to try to get a better read on how much flame reduction is actually there. And you want to see it coming out from the kiln about 1 foot, a little bit vigorously. You want it to be kind of like desperate. So what's happening when that flame's coming out is the fuel is looking for oxygen. So it's coming out of the kiln to find oxygen so that it can burn. And that is exactly what it's also doing to the clay inside the kiln. The clay has a number of chemically bonded oxygen elements in the clay, in each molecule. So the fuel is actually pulling that oxygen out of the clay, and that's what's having the visible effects on clay. So a clay that has iron in it is going to go from being sort of a buff color to probably a darker brown, a richer brown. And then say a porcelain clay is going to go from being sort of a warm white to being a more cool bluish white. And anyway, so that's what's happening in the kiln. Again, with the body reduction, or the time from cone 08 to cone 04, you are reducing pretty much just the clay. And you want to do that for no more than an hour, or at the point that cone 04 falls. So if cone 04 falls before an hour, then you can stop the heavy body reduction at that point, but never let it go for longer than an hour, because you can overdo it and then have all these other side effects of reduction that aren't good on your clay, like brittleness and things like that, making your pieces like so brittle they can't be used. So yeah, so you push the damper in to start body reduction. Usually during body reduction, I don't recommend any adjustments to the gas, because those will, it's like you're changing too many variables at the same time. Then during that time, the kiln may stall just because the fuel is not getting enough oxygen, it's a little inefficient. But then once you get to cone 04 after an hour, you pull the damper back out a little bit. And at that point, the kiln should, if it was stalled, it should start climbing very regularly. So after cone 04, or when you're done with your body reduction, that's actually the time in the kiln when the glazes start melting a little bit. And so then once they start melting a little bit, they're receptive to the effects of reduction. And but when you are reducing the kiln for the benefit of the glazes, you don't want it to be as strong as you want it for what we call the clay body reduction, which is earlier. So once you pull the clay or the kiln out of the body reduction by opening the damper a little bit, you still want a flame, and that flame, a reduction flame coming out of the kiln, but that is for the glaze, and it is much smaller than the amount of reduction that you're having during the body reduction. So that one might only be 6 inches long, and it's wispy. It's not coming out like desperately looking for oxygen. It's just kind of gradually coming out. And that one actually, again, is good to put something over the peephole so that you can try to see it, because it can be a little hard to see. It'll start out being a little bit yellow or orange, and then as the kiln raises in temperature, it will turn often a little bit green. So that I find with the Claytarian in particular, I never take the gas over 3 pounds. You'll be following instructions to know when to turn the kiln up and stuff, but I do end up having to open the squirrel cages just a little tiny bit, maybe every hour or two, to keep that glaze reduction flame from getting too strong like it was during the body reduction. So generally during the body reduction, it's all about adjusting the damper, but after body reduction, a lot of times I am gradually opening the squirrel cages, which is the primary air. Those will come open just a little bit, never more than maybe 3/4 of an inch open during the entire firing, but just a little bit to keep the reduction flame from getting too strong. So you want like a 6-inch lazy flame. And then as the kiln, you're watching the cones to make these adjustments, and as the kiln gets closer to its mature temperature, you want to be watching it a lot more, make sure it doesn't overfire, and then just keep that lazy flame all the way to the end of the firing, at which point you would turn the gas off at the kiln, turn off the main gas, and then also push the damper in so the kiln doesn't cool down too fast.